You can't escape climate change. Whether or not you believe it is happening, you have to hear about it all the time. It is discussed repeatedly on news programs and documentaries. We're guilty of this on our own channel as well, having mentioned climate change in several episodes of a series called Disturbing Discoveries. Usually, climate change discussions focus on events such as rising seas and changing weather patterns. Scientists constantly argue with each other about the finer details. Some people reject the notion entirely and believe the concept is a work of fiction. In this episode, we don't care about any of that. Just look at the name of our channel. Clearly, we can see the freight train of doom that is heading down the tracks straight for the midsection of humanity. Instead, we have a couple of simple questions. Just how high could the carbon dioxide levels get in the atmosphere? And is it possible these levels could cause everyone on the planet to asphyxiate to death? To find out, let's start by looking at the history of carbon dioxide on Earth. Atmospheric history. The Earth was much different when it first formed. Initially, the atmosphere consisted of helium and hydrogen. It didn't take long for these to escape into space. Volcanic eruptions soon filled the Earth with a blanket of gas. This new atmosphere contained a lot of carbon dioxide as well as water vapor and ammonia. The carbon dioxide soon soaked into the earthly oceans. Early bacteria used it for their metabolism and released oxygen as a byproduct. Over hundreds of millions of years, these bacteria changed the composition of the atmosphere so that it had more oxygen. Ironically, this killed the oxygen-producing bacteria, but it did allow the development of more complex life. The Great Oxidation Event, as it is called by scientists, happened around 2.4 billion years ago. Most of Earth's history is lost to us. The earliest date that scientists can measure the carbon dioxide concentration in Earth's atmosphere is around 500 million years ago. At that time, the concentration could range from 3,000 to 9,000 parts per million. The amount has varied greatly over time. A glaciation event about 300 million years ago dropped the levels significantly. Volcanoes again caused it to rise, but it only reached about 1,000 parts per million. From what scientists can determine, carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere have remained relatively stable for millions of years. The levels have also historically been much lower than today. Around 33 million years ago, the carbon dioxide concentration was 280 parts per million. This is the level that was maintained throughout the entirety of human existence until the past couple of hundred years. Today, the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere is at 416 parts per million. If we reduce emissions over the next several years, then it may stop around 450 parts per million. According to NASA, if emissions are not reduced, then in a few centuries those levels could reach 1,500 parts per million. Now we know the worst case scenario. How dangerous could it be? Carbon dioxide toxicity. According to the Centers for Disease Control, if carbon dioxide is encountered at concentrations of 100,000 parts per million, that is immediately dangerous. This level can cause immediate unconsciousness and death. The Earth's atmosphere isn't expected to reach anywhere near this level. But could lower levels still be dangerous? Scientists have studied this in depth. And it's easier to find these answers than you might think. People spend a lot of time indoors, and they exhale carbon dioxide. So the concentration of this gas can be surprisingly high in some buildings. One study found that students in a classroom who experienced levels from 674 to 1450 parts per million more frequently reported headaches. Office workers who encountered carbon dioxide levels up to 2,800 parts per million claimed to have eye irritation and respiratory symptoms, such as coughing and sore throat. Children were studied as well. Concentrations above 1,000 parts per million seemed to increase the risk of dry cough and cold-like symptoms. Noticeable symptoms of carbon dioxide exposure usually don't appear until around 5,000 parts per million, but researchers were able to see some measurable effects in people as low as 500 parts per million. The subjects didn't report feeling anything, but their heart rates and blood pressure were elevated. A noticeable decrease in decision-making performance was apparent starting at 600 parts per million. At this level, the test subjects had problems making correct decisions under pressure. Clearly, if the atmosphere reaches levels of 1,500 parts per million, humanity is going to have some problems. But if the levels never exceed 500 parts per million, does that mean everything will be okay? Of course not. The threat of buildings. Kris Karnauskas is a professor of ocean sciences at the University of Colorado. In 2019, he began walking around campus with a pocket-sized carbon dioxide detector. He didn't want to know what the concentration in the atmosphere was. Kris was trying to figure out how much of this gas was present in the rooms he visited. He found that overnight his bedroom can reach 1,000 parts per million. Even in a large convention center filled with people, the carbon dioxide level is still able to exceed 500 parts per million. Kris is concerned that carbon dioxide levels are already high enough in many buildings that human cognition is impaired, and he thinks this is only going to get worse as atmospheric levels of the gas increase. The only way to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide in a building is by efficient ventilation. Most buildings today are not great at doing this. As carbon dioxide levels increase in the atmosphere, it's going to become increasingly difficult to keep the concentration indoors at a safe level. Just when humanity needs its best and brightest to solve problems related to climate change, carbon dioxide levels might prevent them from thinking clearly. Kris Karnauskas says that if emissions were to reach the worst-case scenarios, then it wouldn't be possible to get a room to levels below 1,300 parts per million. Harvard did their own study in 2016 to find out how carbon dioxide exposure affects the human ability to think. They found that problem-solving abilities decline by about 15% when levels reach 945 parts per million. These abilities fell by half when levels rose to 1,400 parts per million. The result of this trend, if the worst comes to pass, could be that people 100 years from now are only half as smart as we are. And they will be faced with some of the most complex threats humanity has ever faced. Carbon dioxide levels will not suffocate everyone on the planet, but it could threaten civilization as it exists today. Hope for tomorrow. Depressing though it is, the future may not be all bad. Many scientists think that carbon dioxide emissions will not increase. It should go down significantly over the next few years. Renewable energy is becoming more feasible and widespread, which reduces the need for fossil fuels. Carbon sequestration is also a way to offset the effects of human pollution. Planting trees is the simplest way to do this. Better soil management where agriculture is concerned could also help. And new technologies have been developed which may assist with removing carbon from the atmosphere. Of course, there is always the possibility that we simply can't fix this problem. Perhaps we have unknowingly created a chain reaction that causes even more carbon dioxide to be released into the atmosphere. Or maybe volcanoes will suddenly start erupting again and increase the levels beyond anything we can imagine. Even if nature doesn't feel the need to make things worse, an exchange of nuclear weapons which triggers sudden and violent climate change is always possible. Whatever happens, humans will almost certainly still exist on Earth for the foreseeable future. Will it be a pleasant existence or a fate worse than death? The good news is that has yet to be determined. Are you happy to know that your descendants won't choke on their own respiratory byproducts as Earth's atmosphere slowly crushes the life out of them? Or are you depressed by the knowledge that they probably won't do very well on standardized tests? Tell us what you think in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this episode, please hit the like button and consider subscribing to our channel. We'll even destroy 1 carbon dioxide molecule for every new subscriber. See, we really do care. Also, we try really hard to not bother you with advertisements, but nothing is free, and that includes the time and equipment we use to make these episodes. If you would like to support our efforts to bring depressing history to life, then please consider becoming a patron. The link to our Patreon page is in the video description. It's also on our website, badthingsinhistory.com. Thank you for watching Bad Things in History.